now that we have our marvelous space technologies and remote sensing technologies in place, we've been getting better at this over the last 50 to 70 years. One thing has become obvious, and that is the average temperature of the Earth's surface is increasing. If you look at this graph here, this goes back to 1880 when we started collecting temperatures fairly systematically across the planet. And that's the horizontal axis here going on up to our current point in time. And the vertical axis here is how much the temperature has increased over the average temperature. And the average is taken as the average temperature around 1950. If you look at this graph, it's clear that the temperature of the Earth's surface is increasing upwards. Right now, it's about 1 degree Celsius higher than the average, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And this trend upward is not smooth, but it's pretty darn continuous. The warmest years on record have been the last several years. So the Earth, the planet has a bit of a temperature. If we look at this map, this is a map of the world, and it shows how the temperature is distributed across the planet. The redder and the browner, the color, means that the warmer the surface is. If it's blue or light blue or blue, it's a little bit cooler. So you can see that although there are a few spots on the Earth's surface that are a bit cooler recently, most of the Earth is in fact in the yellow to dark brown category. If you look at us here in Wisconsin, this shows that we're perhaps a half a degree Fahrenheit warmer than average. So we're not warming up too much here yet. But if you look at other parts of the planet, parts of the Amazon basin, but particularly here in the north, in the Arctic, you can see that those parts of the world, and including some interesting parts like the Tibet Plateau over here, are really, really warm. Average temperatures in the Arctic are 5 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer recently, and the Arctic is literally melting. The polar ice cap, the ice is not nearly as extensive. The tundra is melting, permafrost is melting, and the top of the world is literally melting, and Antarctica has started to melt also. So clearly the planet has a fever. There are probably half a dozen possible explanations for why the planet's temperature is increasing. And we've been looking at these possible factors for increasing the temperature over the past 20, 30 years. And one possibility, for example, is the sun is getting warmer and more intense. Perhaps that's why we're warming. Well, we've looked over all of these factors and eliminated them all but one, and that is rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. That's clearly the vastly most important reason for why our planet is increasing in temperature. Moreover, we can track where this CO2 is coming from. Possibly it could be from volcanoes, which release CO2 when they erupt. But we can take a look at the chemical makeup of the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and because of its isotope signature, if you're a chemist like Chuck, you know what that means. We can definitively say these rising CO2 levels come from burning fossil fuels. By fossil fuels, we mean coal, oil, natural gas, and of course gasoline, which is a derivative of oil. So rising temperatures come from rising CO2 levels. And if you look at CO2 levels in the atmosphere, this graph shows the present point in time is here on the right side of the graph. And we go backwards to 800,000 years ago. And the red dots here track the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. These older data points come from bubbles in ice cores extracted from the Antarctica. And from 1959 and onward, we have a continuous and really good record of CO2, so we don't have to rely on Arctic ice cores anymore. We can measure it directly in the atmosphere. Since 1959, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has just skyrocketed. It's taken off like a bullet, straight up. It's over 400 parts per million right now. If you look at when Homo sapiens first appeared on this planet, that was about 180,000 years ago. So for all of our history, this is what we've experienced, except right now. So from our perspective, our earthly perspective, from a human perspective, we are definitely entering new territory. And it's because of burning fossil fuels. There's zero controversy in the scientific community at this point. So if we look at fossil fuels and our use of fossil fuels, which are the most important ways of using these fuels that results in increased CO2 in the atmosphere? This graph over here shows various sources of various uses of fossil fuel. For example, generating electricity, the agricultural industry, and other sources. All of these use fossil fuels, which releases CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this gray box here represents the atmosphere, and these little footprints we're going to refer to as carbon footprints. So if you look at electricity, much of our electricity, over half of our electricity at this point in time, is generated by burning coal and natural gas. We are generating more electricity from non-carbon sources, but still the clear majority of our electricity generation comes from burning fossil fuels, which releases CO2 in the atmosphere and leaves a carbon footprint there. Growing food, agriculture, the gas needed, making fertilizer takes quite a bit of energy, and that releases CO2. We use fossil fuels for our egg industry, which releases CO2 and generates its carbon footprint. Industry, think of steel manufacturing, burning coal, making cement generates a whole lot of CO2. And of course, transportation, cars, airplanes, etc., burn gas and oil and release CO2. So there are a variety of sources that use fossil fuel and create carbon dioxide pollution in the atmosphere. Mother Nature is helping us out a bit here. Some of this CO2 that's been released by burning fossil fuels has been absorbed. About 40% has been absorbed so far. About 20% has been absorbed by the ocean. That likely will be slowing down, and it makes the ocean a little bit more acidic, which potentially has some really bad effects. About 25% of the CO2 that's come from fossil fuels has been absorbed by the land, by vegetation, and stored in biomass on land. So Mother Nature has been helping us out quite a bit. That probably will be declining as our CO2 levels in the atmosphere rise. But even now, 60% of the CO2 that is released from burning fossil fuels stays in the atmosphere, and that's why the Earth is warming. So we'll be talking about carbon footprints a lot today, just to give you a heads up. And we're going to be focusing, first of all, on how we generated electricity and the carbon footprint that results from generating electricity that feeds into our homes and businesses. Beth put together this graph, and we'll be looking at a number of these very same graphs this morning. This is a graph of, in this case, our church's carbon footprint. We could make a graph of an individual household's carbon footprint, a business's carbon footprint, the carbon footprint of a state, whatever. These graphs are all put together in the same way. On the vertical axis here, this usually represents tons of CO2 per year that is released into the atmosphere. Tons of CO2 and this CO2 or equivalents of CO2. There are some greenhouse gases that are not CO2, such as methane, but that is translated back into CO2. So we express these fossil fuel emissions in terms of tons of CO2 per year. And the categories along the horizontal axis here represent the different ways that these, in our case, the church is generating using fossil fuel. For example, heating our building with natural gas, running the electricity, using the electricity in our building, and other sorts of CO2 emissions just from keeping the church operating leaves a big carbon footprint. Looks like about 140 tons of CO2 per year are released by just keeping the building in operation. Transportation is another category here. This refers to transportation by staff, normal business transportation, as well as the fact that most of us drive to church when we are coming to church by using a car that produces CO2. Food, we serve food at the church, and that leaves carbon footprint. This is one carbon footprint I wouldn't mind bumping up just a tad bit. Church potlucks are marvelous, in my opinion. And other ways of generating fossil fuels also exist. But one thing that's clear about our church is how much fossil fuel is generated, how much CO2 is generated by keeping the facility in operation. We're going to focus on electricity here specifically. That generates about 70 tons of CO2 per year. Beth put this graph together, and as soon as she showed it to us, it dawned on us there is one solution for dramatically reducing our church's carbon footprint that's pretty easy to do, and that's what I'm going to be talking about now, and it deals with the carbon dioxide released by the electricity that we use. So if we look at the electricity that we get from Xcel, electricity from Xcel is generated by burning coal and natural gas, less coal these days and more natural gas. But when Xcel produces electricity this way, it releases carbon dioxide pollution into the atmosphere, which contributes to global warming. Xcel also generates electricity from clean sources or non-carbon sources, renewable sources in this case. About 1/4 of the electricity Xcel generates comes from wind and solar energy. And they're leaders across the nation in doing this. And the goal is to crank this up to 80% and hopefully to eventually, maybe 2050 or so, to have 100% of its electricity generated from these renewable sources and not use coal and natural gas at all anymore. There's some other non-carbon sources that Xcel uses, such as hydroelectric dams and that sort of thing. So this is how Xcel makes electricity. It feeds into the grid, and this comes to all of us. So the electricity that we use here at the church comes from some clean sources, but about half of the electricity that Xcel makes comes from coal and natural gas. Well, Xcel and most other electricity providers offer a way to eliminate this dirty electricity. They offer a program called Renewable Connect. It's a way to purchase green electricity. What that amounts to is if we pay a fee to Xcel each year, or each month in our case, and in our case this amounts to about $1,000 a year. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the electricity we use here in the church does leave a carbon footprint because it comes from coal and gas. If we're willing to enroll in this program from Xcel, this fee we pay each month, each year, generates more renewable electricity. They add it online, and we can buy exactly the amount of green electricity here that we generate now in a dirty way by burning coal and natural gas. And by purchasing this clean electricity, we eliminate our carbon footprint. And at this point, all of the electricity that we contribute, that we're responsible for in this grid, is renewable. 100% of our electricity now that is dumped on the grid on our behalf is renewable. So that's a really great way of eliminating our carbon footprint very quickly. All of us as homeowners have the same option. I'm going to try to drive home the fact that I think this is a good program for us to consider using in our individual homes. So we'll be talking about how to enroll in this program to generate green electricity and dump it into the grid and eliminate our carbon footprints later on this morning. So back to our church. After we've purchased the green electricity, our carbon footprint drops down like that, from 202 metric tons of CO2 per year down to 130. We've decreased our carbon footprint by about 30%. We have no more carbon footprint because of our electricity usage, which is a good thing.